You were at San Francisco State University, right? So that's fun. Don't go to universities because they're pretty damn pathological. So now you went there and you were invited to go there. So you're actually a guest, right? So in principle, they should treat you nicely since you're a guest and you're taking your time and energy to go talk to people. Who invited you and why? And what happened when you went there?
I was invited by the Leadership Institute, which is an organization that tries to advance, really they uphold the freedom of speech. They try to advance the conservative movement on college campuses. And so I spoke at a Turning Point event. I'll kind of fill you in step by step of what this looked like. I got there. I was supposed to meet the campus police department an hour and a half before the event. We were set to meet at this parking garage and then walk over to the event together. The police never showed up. And so I didn't think much of it. You know, there was still an hour and a half before, so I figured I could just walk over and I'm sure they would make their way over. We would talk about an exit strategy if something were to happen, which I thought I knew what I was getting myself into. I knew this was San Francisco. I knew this was a different environment, which almost excites me, not because I want controversy or because I'm looking for arguments, but because this is an opportunity to get in front of people who don't agree with me. I was more hopeful that they would come with somewhat of an open mind, to which they simply didn't. There were some civil.
Yeah, that was definitely naive. That was definitely naive. But, you know, that's excusable and acceptable. While you were going to a university campus, did you think you were a conservative?
Sorry, did you say did they think or do I think?
No, do you? Well, you know, you talked to Turning Point. That's Charlie Kirk's organization.
Right.
It's definitely a conservative organization. Did you have, before all of this, did you consider yourself a political creature? Did you have a political home or an affiliation?
I've always been politically in tune. I've always been pretty up to date and knowledgeable about the different issues we face and what that looks like. And typically my views do align conservative. That's not to say every view. I'm not someone who is going to feel like I have to lean a certain way because that's how I align. That's not me. But I like to be well-versed. I like to be knowledgeable about what's going on. And so I've always been in tune, shall we say, but by no means did I have any sort of political background or any sort of ulterior motive to where I wanted to be in the position that I'm in.
Right. So you weren't a political actor.
Oh, goodness, no.
Yeah, okay.
But always tried to be knowledgeable. Who's where, who's doing what. Always watch the news and things of that. But by no means did I feel equipped for the position I'm in. I still don't. I'm learning.
No, I bet.
I'm learning every day.
Okay, so back to SFU. You're there. The police who are supposed to help you don't show up. And so you're looking forward to this event. And so let's continue walking through the day's events.
So we walk over to the room. It's in a building. It's on the third floor. Very quickly, the room fills up. It's about 50-50 supporters versus protesters in the room. But they very quickly reached the maximum capacity, to which the administrators who were present said, we're not allowing anyone else in the room. And I was cool with that. I understood up at this point that there was some counter events going on, some protests around campus, one of which they organized this big sign-making event where the protesters, they got together and they all made signs and they all walked over together. They orchestrated a sit-in to where they sat in the speech, which again, I understand. That's your right to protest. You have the right to organize. By no means do I think that I'm worthy of stopping that. That's understandable, as long as, again, it's civil and somewhat respectful, right? So I was able to deliver my speech. I talked for probably 40 minutes, and let me reiterate what my speech was. I talked about what it takes to compete at that level, my background, how this is a lifelong journey. I talked about the competition. I talked about the locker room. I talked about the silencing piece, not just from the female athletes, but parents, administrators, medical professionals even. Nothing opinionated. Really, my speech, there's no opinions in it. It's strictly my experience. So I was able to deliver the speech. I answered questions afterwards, to which I was met with lots of questions and oppositions, which I find extremely easy to answer. Whether they take my answer, that's on them, but they're all easy to answer. But it was only after the speech. I just had concluded. It had been probably an hour. Everyone was standing up to leave. And as people were standing to leave, first of all, I should mention, while I was giving my speech, I could hear people outside the building. I could hear them chanting, and it was a large group of people, you could tell. I could hear them chanting things such as trans women are women or other chants they could come up with. But as I continued my speech, I could hear chants getting closer and closer to when I concluded. I could hear these people right outside the hallway, to where one side of the hallway would yell, "Trans rights are under attack." The other side of the hallway would yell back, "What do? We fight back." And so I could hear this, which was a bit unnerving, just to know that they were right outside the door. But again, I didn't really let it bother me. That's not something that necessarily shook me at the time. But everyone stood up to leave. All of a sudden, a mob of people enter into the room. They rush into the room. They flicker the lights. They turn the lights off. And this is when they rush to the podium where I was and some other members of the Turning Point chapter were. And this is where we were met with assault and violence. And
so they turned the lights off. So how dark is it in there when the lights are off?
This period is a blur to me. It all happened so quickly. I felt so disoriented. I felt so jostled. I felt so confused. What is happening? I was told, granted, I never talked with the police before this, but the Turning Point members told me, the police said they're going to lock the doors at a certain time. There should be no problems. We'll be good. So I was under the impression that the doors would be locked, which they were not. So it all just happened so quickly. But yes, they turned the lights off, and it was nighttime outside, so it's pitch black in this room, which of course you have to imagine.
So it's really dark. Oh, so that was a sneaky little move.
You have to imagine.
Yeah, the campus police are completely. Of course it's intentional. They know exactly what they're doing, and the campus police are 100% unprepared for any real aggression.
Absolutely.
They're. Yeah. And I mean, to some degree, that's on them and it's on the administration, but it's also outside their normal course of training and activity. They have no idea what to do. So the idea that you're going to be protected by campus police on campus, you can bloody well just forget about that. That's not going to happen. Okay, so now it's dark. And who is it that's rushing you exactly? And how many of them are there?
A mob of trans rights activists, whether that be trans individuals themselves, whether that be people within this LGBTQ community, whether that be someone who just considers themselves an ally to this community. There were so many different, I don't want to say combinations of a person, but there were men dressed as women and women dressed as men and everything in between. So it was very, again, disorienting. It was like, who am I being met with? What is happening? So as the lights are flickering, the lights are on, they're off, an officer approaches me very quickly, and she grabs me. And she's wearing nothing that indicates she's an officer. And again, I hadn't met her. She never alerted me she was in the room. Her face is covered with a mask. And she tells me very quickly, trying to pull me along, as more people are filtering into the room. She says, "Come with me. I'm with the police." And I didn't believe her. Why would I believe her, right? So I was very hesitant. I was reluctant, but truthfully, I had no other choice at this point because we were being rushed at the front of the room. So we kind of navigate out of the room. We're only met with more protesters once we get into the hallway. We couldn't even come out of the door of the classroom because there were so many people filtering in that we had to go out this back door that led us to another classroom to get out that way. To which when we got to the hallway, you look down to the staircase, there's hundreds of people. You look down to the other staircase, of course, which is your exit path to get out of the building, and it's hundreds of people. So ultimately, we had no other choice than this officer led me to another room along that same hallway where I was barricaded for 3 hours, over 3 hours, which was interesting. It was, you in those moments, in those hours, you fear for your life, hearing what these people are yelling, hearing the things they want to do to you. an array of things, all of which were violent and vengeful and hateful, and all of the words, of course, in the
Well, let's hear them. Let's hear them. What did they tell you?
Some of the things they were yelling.
Away.
One of the terms they kept using, which I think is so ironic, they kept saying, "We fight back." And I thought about this, and I thought the day before this event, the press secretary of the Biden administration in a press conference said the words, "Our trans community, they're resilient and they fight back." And so it just kept replaying in my head. Wow, they're using verbatim the same verbiage that Jean-Pierre, whatever her name is using. They were yelling things.
I see. So this is right from the top. That's one of the things that really makes you wonder just exactly what country you're in at a time like that, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
When the people who are threatening you and barricading you in because you're objecting to being, what would you say, subjected to an unfair competition by any reasonable standard, and now you're being mobbed by half-demented lunatics who are directly acting out words that have come from the highest possible state or, well, federal authorities. Yeah, that's real cute. There's a betrayal for you. That's a nice one.
They were yelling things such as to the officers who were standing outside. They were saying, you're only protecting her because she's white. They were yelling things, they were yelling things such as, you shouldn't have come here. You should have known what you were getting yourself into. You knew we would riot. Let her out of that room so we can handle her ourselves.
What do you think would have happened? What do you think would have happened, just out of curiosity, or what were you imagining would happen if they would have got access to you?
It's a scary thought.
Do you have any sense? Like realistic? Yeah.
It's a scary thought.
We saw what happened to Posey Parker in New Zealand, right? I mean, she got mobbed quite nicely, and she had tomato soup doused on her. It never got to the point of, permanent physical violence. But
they would have.
What do you think would have happened?
I think just that. I think these people, based off of what they were saying, they were explicitly saying they wanted to hurt me. I don't know to what extent that looks like, but I'll tell you, these people they were unhinged. They were relentless. And that's something they kept saying is, we're not letting up.
Right. Well, and they're in a mob too, which is always a bad thing, right? Because even if each of those people was only 5% insane on their own, in a mob, they're 100% insane. And so, and so how many people are in there barricaded in with you? And why were the barricades effective? Why didn't they just hammer down the doors and have at her?
It was just in terms of people in the room, other than the officers, it was just me in that room. There was a few officers who would filter in and out. But there was a few campus officers who stood outside the door who kept people from, I guess, tearing down the door.
How did they treat you? How did the officers themselves treat you? What was their attitude towards you like?
I, of course, respect law enforcement and applaud them for their job because it's a hard job and it's a thankless job. But these officers were, I don't know if pitiful is too harsh, but they were terrified. They were terrified.
Yeah.
They were scared to be seen as anything other than an ally to this community. There was one person in the mob who was African-American who, I guess the officer just had to push around a little, and to which this person yelled back, you're only doing this because I'm African-American. I'm going to sue. And so these officers, they don't want to put themselves in that position. They've seen how that's gone in the past, again, to a much greater extreme. But they don't want to deal with this. They want all hands off deck. So it affected how they did their job. They were terrified of creating a safe exit strategy for me, using force by any means. I missed my flight home, to which I told them, I'm gonna miss my flight. Is there something we can do? I want to go home. I don't want to be stuck in San Francisco anymore. To which at this point, I began to get upset.
Right. So you're essentially, at that point, you're essentially kidnapped.
Well, it gets even better from there because inside this room, I could hear these protesters on the outside. And probably 2 hours or so in, maybe 2.5, these protesters, the dean of students shows up. These protesters are trying to negotiate if I make it home safely. They're saying if she wants to make it home, she has to pay us. To which the dean of students is negotiating with them. They all claim
pay you. What pay you? Meaning what?
I had to pay the mob. That's what they were claiming.
What did you have to pay them?
A couple suggestions
the
were
idea?
made. One person suggested, if she wants to make it home safely, she has to pay us $10 each, which is so silly. But
It's not
truthfully,
silly. It's kidnapping.
I
It's not silly. It's horrible. It's beyond reproach.
And
it's
so-
or beyond. It's beyond surreal. Oh, that's amazing. And so the dean of the dean of students didn't take names and decide that those were some students that could be easily dispensed with and removed from the campus permanently. She decided she'd negotiate with them and play nice, because after all, they were doing was kidnapping you and extortion and engaging in extortion with the threat of violence. That's all they were doing. Whereas you were, complaining about the fact that you'd been subjected to an utterly unfair competition by officials that had betrayed you. That's your crime. Their crime is kidnapping and extortion.
and you'll
Right.
love this.
Cute.
Because after this event, I can talk a little bit about how I actually got out. But after this event, rather than releasing a statement saying we condemn violence or we have to uphold the freedom of speech, the vice president of student affairs, her name is Dr. Jamila Moore, she sent out an email to their student body. In this email, it says, "We applaud our brave students. They were in a situation where they were met with adversity. They were met with, they were put in a very hard circumstance listening to someone who spreads violence. And we applaud their bravery and their peaceful protest." Sent an email to their university describing what I went through as peaceful. And so I read this.
Yeah.
And I'm so curious.
Well, that's a real backhanded compliment that you're a sufficiently terrifying force to have oppressed, 200 rampaging mobsters. You really are quite the monster if you were able to manage that.
Exactly.
While you're being barricaded in a room and essentially kidnapped and extorted. So, that's definitely a compliment to
Totally.
you in the most backhanded possible way. Yeah. Well, it's quite something to watch this, this offer of an extended sense of victimization to the perpetrators themselves. Had to undergo all the trauma of having to listen to you describe how you were betrayed by the NCAA and by the Biden administration and by all the virtue signaling dimwits who thought that forcing you and your teammates to compete against a man was actually acceptable and morally justifiable. And so now we're in a situation where your mere attempts to defend yourself are regarded as some variant of hate speech and provocation to violence. Yeah, that's perfectly goddamn delightful. That's a lovely way to think about it. So, I don't suppose you heard from anyone like Kamala Harris, for example, complimenting you on your bravery. I know she sent off a missive a while back to Dylan Mulvaney, letting him know what a brave soul he was for doing whatever the hell it is that he's doing. I don't suppose you heard anything from anybody up in the Democratic authorities
I
complimenting
sure have
you on
not.
your bravery.
Absolutely
I
not.
bet you haven't.
No.
Yeah.
That is, I'm not holding my breath.